to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klickenberg. Got my friend Rob Richardson in the studio today. Rob,
how you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Rob, you sent me a list of topics that is really awesome. It's like I want to talk about everything on this list. I know we're not going to get to it all, but I want to try to get to as much of it as we can because these are just some really, really great topic areas. We've known each other for 20, 25 years at this point?
Probably more than that. I was thinking it's almost 30 because we met at a MARC long-range forecast committee meeting, I think, when I worked at HNTB, and that's been a long time ago.
You have a much better memory than I do. So that's great. So for those who don't know you, Rob, let's talk a little bit about your background. You're a planner, but how did you come into planning and talk just sort of the short history of your bio?
Well, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, so I worked for Freilich Leitner, which is kind of a boutique land use law firm that had a planning group. And I didn't get into law school where I wanted to go. And they said, well, why don't you go to planning school at KU? You like KU. And, so that's what I did. So I became a planner and I got to work on a lot of interesting projects at the law firm. And then I went to HNTB and was there a little bit. I was mostly working for the City of Independence on different contracts, some really cool projects that we did. The Midtown Trim and Road Corridor, the first TIF projects in Independence. So then I went to work they hired me from HNTB to implement some of the plans I'd written. And so I was there for 5 years. Then I was director in Raymore for a little bit, 18 months. And that was a crazy experience we could talk about for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then I went to KCK to be the director. And I was the director there for about 17 years. And then the last 2 years I was there, I was kind of the fixer. So all of the different development folks in the city didn't report directly to me, but I coordinated all their work and they kind of had to listen to what I said and, answer my phone calls and stuff. So that was really fun because I got to be the yes guy to everybody that came in the city instead of the planning directors, kind of the no, you got to do it like this guy. So that was kind of fun. Huh. And then in October, I started my own business, Richardson Brothers Development, and do development services for people in the development community. And we'll be doing some of our own development.
So it's kind of an interesting, private to public, back to private sector travel. For those who aren't familiar with Kansas City, so when you start, Independence is kind of I don't know how you describe Independence. It's probably the oldest city in the metro area, but we think of it as a suburb now.
It's a first string suburb. The riverboats came in there, and that's where all the California, Oregon, Santa Fe trails all started in Independence. Mm-hmm. They came up from the river and got their supplies on the square, and then headed out from there. So it's a very old city. Mm-hmm. But more modern this century times. It has kind of old industrial areas. It has all the pre-war stuff and industrial pre-war stuff. It has post-war suburbs, and it has 70s, 80s modern to now modern suburbia. So It's got all three cities. And Kansas City, Kansas actually has the same thing. Right. It's just flipped east to west. Yeah, it's like the same city, but you just flop it.
Yeah. And then in between those two, you had Raymore, which is basically a newer suburb. It was a tiny rural town that's become a suburb on the southern edge.
Yeah, it's a fast-growing commuter suburb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, that's an interesting kind of diversity of communities to work on the planning side or work on the public side. What did they share anything? Were there shared experiences with those that were helpful, or were they all very different?
I would say that they all three had kind of weird politics at different times. And that, that's always an interesting part of the planning development side is what are the politics? And, generally they were all wanting growth, but not necessarily growth like we'll probably talk about so much today. But I guess they all needed code work. And so I was kind of a code policy wonky kind of person. Mm-hmm. So I helped with a lot of code work in the cities, trying to expand residential choice in ways that were acceptable to those communities. But Independence and KCK were very much alike in that you had to, if you were going to write a code, you had to write it for really three different cities. Mm-hmm. You had to write it for the old city, the post-war city, and the modern city. And making all those codes simple and work was very challenging for those communities. And then, what do the people say about that and how do they apply to the people that actually live there?
Mm-hmm. And, KCK is interesting because in many ways, it's like the forgotten stepsister of the metro area. And I mean, it's got incredible assets as an older city, but it's just overlooked so much. And it's also, largely a pretty poor community. So, I mean, that must have had a ton of challenges from a planning director standpoint.
Well, it is the urban area is relatively poor, and in the last 20 years, it's become very Hispanic, as opposed to in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was largely African American. And there's some conflicts there. There was a lot of blight. The city tore down over 4,000 houses, and about half of them they just dumped the rubble in the basement and covered it up. But that's kind of a blessing and a curse. Now there's opportunities for the type of infill development that we think is great for our communities in that city. But you still have a lot of urban poor, a lot of homelessness. But I think that we never really tried to get caught up in that. There never been a real policy plan done for the community, and so I kind of fought to get that done. And then that kind of suggested doing area plans. And one of the area plans I thought was key to do was for the Northeast area, because it had never really had any focus on it. And that's where most of the urban poor issues were really manifesting themselves. So I think that was really, a really positive thing for the city. It's a struggle to implement any plan. Plans have to change over time, but and some things that I thought we were all on the same page for 5 years later, they're like, I don't think we were on the same page for that. I'm like, well, okay, so how do we fix that? Those kind of issues. But it was very interesting to work in KCK. I still live there. I'm not going to move because you had such a variety of things. There were years when we were doing more than $1 billion of development, and we were doing small infill projects. So it was very, very diverse, very interesting as a director, because you had all kinds of stuff to work on. If you were getting tired of suburban residential, then you had the recession. Then it became, kind of mass industrial warehousing and huge projects like General Motors body and paint factory, or Amazon, or Urban Outfitters, super high tech distribution facilities. So it was very interesting.
When you were younger and thinking about, were you working at a law firm and then you're going back to planning school, did you ever think planning director was something you were going to end up doing?
I originally thought I would, very early in my career, I'd be a developer, but that kind of, I had a family real early. And so, risk aversion became a thing for a while. And when we did the second TIF project in Independence, Homart, which was at the time maybe the world's largest retail developer, if not certainly the nation's, they were the development arm of Sears. And so we got the theaters on 39th Street approved with that. And Dan, the guy that represented Homart, and Mary, their attorney from Chicago, took Joy and I to dinner at a real nice restaurant here in Kansas City. And I said, so when you see this project coming, it's a $25 million project. You get $12.5 million in TIF. You got 80% leased for 15-year national tenants. Why don't you, tell Homart to go away and just make that happen yourself? He says, oh, you're right. That's an amazing project. The top one, or maybe the second best project I've ever seen. I'd never risk my family's future on that project. That stuck with me for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, because basically in 12 years, you're going to own a $25 million asset.
Yeah.
And almost no risk, right?
Yeah.
But that's too risky for that guy to put his family on the line for.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I remember that for a long time. My wife remembered it too. So,
Yeah. I mean, that says a lot about kind of the nature of those larger, especially retail oriented projects, or that business environment changes so quickly. I mean, just the changes we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years, with the internet coming around and everything else. And it's just every decade or so, it seems like a huge upheaval. So I mean, I can see that.
And AMC was a big tenant. So we all know what's going on with AMC in the last few years.
Right.
So.
Right. Are you one of the Reddit meme stock fans for AMC?
No. but I do a lot of scouting work, and we had some kids on camp staff that were part of that and part of the GameStop thing that like one of their dads said, yeah, he made more money than I did last year. He was a college student and worked at scout camp.
Yeah. Some of that stuff makes me feel so old, but, so, I mean, one of the things we had the good fortune to work together a number of times. And, I think one of the reasons we always clicked, there's a certain kind of development, obviously, that we both liked. We liked the older style, walkable communities and all of that. But you had an interesting role, I thought, in KCK, like some of the projects we worked on together, but also stuff that I watched you do. You were always, it seemed like you were always trying to figure out how to use your role to push for as good a quality on the design side as you possibly could. And I'm curious what you might say about that, or what advice you might give to others, especially in, again, you're not in a wealthy community.
It was interesting. So in 2004, we did design guidelines and new zoning procedures. And when we went to adopt it, it was only going to be for the area west of 94th Street. So all of the new area of town. And the District 1 commissioner in the urban area that I've talked about, that's experienced all this demolition, says, you can't just do that. You'll create two cities that way. You have to apply those design guidelines citywide. And we said, well, they're kind of an experiment. And so why don't we see how they work? And in 2 years, we're going to start doing citywide master plan. And if they work, we'll just adopt them citywide as part of that master plan. And so that's what we did. And, it's, you get 15% of the facade that you can play with. It's not hard materials. So if you want to do fancy cornices with EFS or something like that, I guess you could, but we didn't allow EFS. You'd have to use something else, but there's a lot of different stuff out there now than there was then. I think one of the hardest things with design standards was the changing of materials, like metal siding. The new Cerner office buildings are the super high tech anodized stainless steel. Well, that didn't even exist really when we wrote the design standards. And so they had to get an exception to that for that building. And that's, you can say what you want to about kind of the data shapes of the windows and spacing and all that, but that building changes color in the light. It is so cool. It can be white and it can be black and every color of brown and bronze in between because of what the light's doing. So I think that part of it's really cool, whether you like the fenestration on the building or not.
How much of a challenge was that for you working with not just the larger entities, but smaller developers as they were trying to do things in KCK and pushing on them on the design side?
Part of it is that if somebody's going to go do a new build, it's almost not mom and pop anymore. I mean, if you can finance a new build that you're going to go buy a half an acre or an acre of land and build a building in a parking lot, you have the means to borrow $2, $3, $4 million. That's kind of out of mom and pop range to me, right? The mom and pop stuff is in the remodeling things and the reuse of the existing buildings. And so one of the things that I've always tried to, work for and worked really closely at building inspection on is, how do we make these codes fit the old buildings? And then you get the, I forget what the name of the code is, but now there's actually an adopted code for renovating old buildings.
Yeah. There's a historic buildings code or something like that.
Yeah. And so, I thought that was great, because we had issues with they can't rebuild the stairs. They would come out of the building. How do you do that? So you'd have, and working on those kind of issues, and a little bit of parking. Sometimes, the way the codes are set up, so one thing to know about KCK is it's like the standard zoning code from the 70s. It had a little bit of update in the 80s and, amended significantly over time. But so, it had the standard parking regulations and, you'd need, and the use conversions that triggered things the building code were already hard. And what did that do? Not only the building code, but the zoning code. And sometimes it was like, this building over here might work better for you, and there wasn't a lot of reuse probably until after the turn of the century. Then we started seeing more. And then maybe after the recession, we started seeing a lot more people went in to look at those old buildings and what can they really do with them. And there's a lot of that going on at KCK right now.
Yeah.
And incremental developers and little guys that start with one building and they might, since I've known them, they've gone from their first project and they're on project 5 or 6 now.
Mm-hmm.
But they've kind of figured out what kind of tenants to look for and what kind of spend they can do on the insides, and how do you really do the inside of a historic building well or not.
Yeah.
And what does it take? What is the spend on that? So it's been fun to watch that.
Yeah. It's interesting because you think about some of the older neighborhoods in KCK, and obviously one of the more popular ones is Strawberry Hill, which has a tremendous location, great old architecture, great views of downtown Kansas City, Missouri, and everything else. And it kind of seems like, it seems like for 20 or 25 years, people have been talking about Strawberry Hill. It's Strawberry Hill's next. Strawberry Hill's next. They're the next place up to be hot. And it actually seems like
5 years ago, before Airbnb hit.
Yeah. I mean,
rich.
Yeah. Now it seems like it's finally happened. It's like that area is really starting to pop in ways that it hadn't before.
It's had a lot of investment in it. They've got some great restaurants and bars. You got
Mm-hmm.
Mockingbird and Slaps and Chicago's and several
Mm-hmm.
others in the old Colonial Club.
Yeah.
A lot of places in there that are great. Slaps Barbecue is like my favorite place in town.
Yeah.
So if you're Kansas City barbecue fans and you haven't been to Slaps, you got to go to Slaps.
Oh, it's fantastic.
They just won the NFL draft barbecue contest too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh.
But the thing that really kind of hurt, I guess, Strawberry Hill in some ways is Airbnb, because the net present value of a house rented out for $100 a night
Mm-hmm.
for 60% of the year makes that house worth like $300,000.
Yeah.
And 10 years ago, you could have bought houses up and down Strawberry Hill for 65 to 85, and
Yeah.
and it's really I never really thought we'd see gentrification in Kansas City, just
Mm-hmm.
because we don't grow that fast and we don't change that fast.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a little bit in some of the neighborhoods around Valentine and things. You got occasionally you get a high growth neighborhood, but it wasn't like miles and miles. But Airbnb it's done it in Rosedale. It's done it in Strawberry Hill. It's like all of a sudden you see a house for sale in Rosedale or Strawberry Hill for 250 or 300,000. You're like, what?
Mm-hmm.
That's a bungalow, that when I moved to the city, you could have bought for 55 or 60.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's had a huge impact, even in Midtown, and, our city, KCMO, just passed brand new rules to strictly limit Airbnb use. But I mean, KCK obviously I think was a popular location because houses were cheap, location wise. It's still very central to everything.
And we required special use permits for them because I interpreted the old code to do that so that
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't have to write anything. And they just went through that process too and adopted some new codes on that. But it was, the higher property values is good because KCK had a problem. Like with my house,
Mm-hmm.
I bought an old historic house on a roundabout
Mm-hmm.
with a garage in the back. So it's the perfect planter house, and the properties were so inexpensive that you could buy it, but you couldn't borrow any money to fix them up.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would have new professionals come into the city and want to live in an urban neighborhood. Well, I can buy the house, but I can't get an appraisal on the house, and I can't get an appraisal that allows me to redo the kitchen in the master bathroom,
Mm-hmm.
And so those kind of issues were very real. And some neighborhoods are still very real in KCK, but I think that the higher property values are letting people improve those properties where they might have been able to buy it for 85, but they couldn't have spent the 50 on it they wanted to spend to make it really nice and modern and livable and update the wiring and the plumbing and all that kind of stuff. So there's been some good benefits to that.
So, I mean, that's a common problem in a lot of places that, have seen neighborhoods that have seen hard times, and maybe now you start to think they're on the cusp of redevelopment or whatever, but it's almost like it's a cash economy and people can't really get financing the way they would want to. Were there things from the standpoint of the city, from the city government side, that you all talked about or tried to implement that could impact that?
We went to every kind of conference you could imagine and banking, talked to banking people and trying to get bankers to spend money and allocate money to spend on those kind of things. And it really, none of that worked.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was, and I was invested in it. I kind of got lucky because we had a property bump when my 95-year-old tile roof had to be taken off and put back on.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were lucky to hit the bump in the property values where I could actually borrow money right when I needed it. to do that.
Yeah.
So, because that's an expensive thing.
Yeah.
Green tile roofs from the 1920s or
Yeah.
that tile is hard to find in the country.
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason it's a roof you replace like every 100 years.
Right.
So
it's cool.
Yeah. And like your neighborhood, that's a really nice neighborhood. It's a beautiful neighborhood. It's a National Historic Landmark district,
Correct,
isn't it? Yeah. And so even that one, it was struggling to hit the thresholds to where you could get financing.
Right. And another thing old neighborhoods struggle with is just people that know how to work on those houses.
Yeah.
And what the tricks are. I'm lucky I have a neighbor who grew up in the neighborhood and his dad taught him, and he's worked on, he moved into his parents' house and he's done that. So he's showed me some tricks of the trade for old houses because, we've got built-in gutters. I've never dealt with that before in my life, and most people that move into these neighborhoods don't know any of this stuff. How do you deal with an old rock foundation? I want to change the layout of the rooms. Well, none of these 2x4s are those. Why do I have this dip in my wall? Because I didn't fur out my 2x4s another 1/4 of an inch because all the wood's a different dimension. There's all these crazy. We were lucky. Our house had been remodeled in the 60s. And so it's got all copper plumbing and all 3-strand wire in it. That identical house that used to be adjacent to or used to be connected to ours. It was like the mother-in-law house, but it's identical. You used to be able to walk between the kitchens. That's still on a boiler, still has 2-strand wire, window units, it's like, and that's a huge, we were very lucky, and I probably wouldn't have bought the house if it hadn't been. It's just that, I know enough about the building trades to know that would have been a terrible project.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the narrow lot stuff that we worked on. So, God, I don't even know when we did this. Do you remember when we did the
2006 or 2008? Maybe.
Yeah. So you hired my old firm to help you all work on some design guidelines, basically for narrow lots. Why don't you talk about what was the genesis for that? What were you all trying to do from the city side?
So I talked earlier about the 4,000 lots that got demolished. So we had those 4,000 lots that were demolished by the city or houses, and probably another 2,000 that were done privately. So we had 6,500 lots that didn't conform to the current zoning code. They were less than 50 feet wide. And so anytime anybody wanted to build a house, you had to, replat the lot and get variances. And it just made instead of being able to walk in and get a building permit in a day or two, it took you 90 to 180 days to get through the process to build an urban house. And so we want to do something to kind of rectify that. Right. So we thought if we did a new zoning code that allowed people to build on the 25-foot lots, that'd be great. But at the time, politically, they wanted to make sure that didn't allow people to bring in a home on a trailer and set it on blocks,
right,
and call that good.
Right.
And that's probably, I don't know. We won't talk about whether that's good or bad.
Yeah.
So we had design guidelines that kind of said, meet the neighborhood. One of the tragedies, I think, in this world is the street in San Francisco, the old Victorian townhouses, and then somebody built a modern one where there's a fire and somebody built a modern one. To me, that's a tragedy. So and then we have the professor at KU that likes to build his shoe boxes and then move them into beautiful urban neighborhoods. And, so we're trying to kind of limit some of that stuff. And how do you do this and make it work? And so we made it so you could build a single family home on a 25-foot lot without a variance. And I think the tricky thing we did there that was really cool was it said in single family zoning, if you own the whole face of the block, and there are hundreds of block faces, obviously you could buy the whole block from the land bank or acquire it privately. You could build a flat over flat duplex on each end, a couple of single family houses, and then fill the middle with attached townhouses. So you could go from a lot that might have had 8 houses on it to one that might have 16 or 20 houses on it in those urban neighborhoods. And we allowed ADUs within that. And I thought it would just be like a rocket ship taking off and we would do hundreds of them. In the first 5 years, I think there were 60 of them done, which in urban KCK, that
seems like a lot.
It was a lot. I was hoping it would have been 10 times that. Right. But, that was, and there were issues, we wanted front porches and we wanted to walk up to it. And, we wanted garages in the back off of alleys. And within the first 2 or 3 years, we did a couple of amendments to, where now when you build a new subdivision, it's graded so that you can, the land rises up to the house a little bit so that you don't have drainage issues. And, a lot of these older neighborhoods, you had really steep hills, you had weird topography that you didn't want to force people to change. And so we made some amendments about how the house related to the street and elevation, and if you had to use alleys or not, because there's a great 3 or 4 of them on Strawberry Hill, the north end of Strawberry Hill by the KU hospital there, the new KU part of KU there, where they, the alley, you could have put a garage on the house, but the garage would have been the 3rd floor of the house. So, how do you use the garages and set them back? And I think that, they look pretty good and they fit with the neighborhoods where they've done that. And so I think it was very effective. And then during the recession, actually, we almost got to the point, we were probably 40, where normally it'd be like 90% suburban homes, 10% urban. We got to about 40-60 on the permit, but we were only doing 120, 150 permits a year then instead of 500. But, doing 70 or 80 urban houses a year, that's a great,
Yeah. I mean, that seems like still for KCK, that's a big accomplishment, especially if they're able to get it through in an easier permitting process.
Right.
What were some of the things that builders pushed back on, for the guidelines?
We had extra landscaping. So we had like 3 bushes and 2 trees instead of 1 tree.
Yeah.
So, the builders don't like that necessarily.
Yeah.
And we had 50-year material requirements. And most of them just said, okay, we'll use Hardy Ward, one of the hardest things is when you're on these 25-foot lots, the fire code gets you because you have to have firewall, your interior walls end up being, between the 2 houses end up being firewalls. So that makes it hard to have windows and things. So we've worked through some of those issues with the builders. I think those were about the most significant things. There were some topographic issues we dealt with. And,
well, all those neighborhoods have hill in the name for a reason. I mean, they're all extremely steep neighborhoods.
This is true. Yeah. So I think those were the biggest things. I didn't really go back and look at that before we talked today, but those are the things I remember off the top of my head. Yeah.
I remember seeing a bunch of them that did end up with the garage off the front. And then, but like a porch, over the top of it or whatever. And I thought, given the topo considerations, a lot of those came out really well.
Yeah. And if you look at it from the long view down the street, so if they're on the other corner and you're looking at it, you don't really see them. As you drive by them, you see them, but and I don't know that it's bad to see the garage necessarily, but in those old neighborhoods, a lot of the houses didn't have garages when they were built before you needed a garage. And, a lot of the garages were built after the fact off the back alley.
And a lot of those alleys were even barely, drivable.
Well, originally they were probably drivable, but over time we did 0 alley maintenance. And, we might've worked on our first alleys in KCK in decades, probably in the 2010, 2012 range.
Yeah.
To help with some of the urban development, CHWC, community housing in Wyandotte County was doing a lot of urban housing, and, they just needed our help on that.
Yeah. Who were, I know a little bit about CHWC, and it's interesting to mention them. I mean, who were the people who were building most of these new houses?
Oh, well, when I started, it was almost exclusively CHWC, and then,
which is a housing nonprofit.
Nonprofit. City Vision was a housing not for profit that doesn't exist anymore. And that was it. Those 2 were building almost everything. And so we worked really closely with them on all the infill stuff, and their issues with getting all the variances on those old lots were really what prompted me to think about, well, how do we fix this?
And today, is that still the case where, I mean, are they the dominant ones, or have for-profit people come in the last several years?
So CHWC still builds urban housing. In Douglas Sumner, they built some there. I'd say they're still probably the dominant one, but there are some private folks doing things now.
Yeah.
One of the big things that kind of spurred that was we, for a long time, we didn't take actual structures into our land bank through the tax sale. And then we said, what if we take them into, what if we pre-certify remodelers and we take these structures into the tax sale through the tax sale? We're going to demolish them at some point anyway, if they get too bad, and let them bid on them. And we know we're not going to get very much from them, but we did 70 or 100 in the first 2 years, and they went from $4,000 properties to 80 to $250,000 properties.
So they were buying them and remodeling them.
Yeah, these were structures that were on our demolition list that we saved. It was like, that's 100 lots we don't have to refill in the future.
Yeah,
but when people started seeing that those remodeled nicer homes would make money, then some other people started looking to get land bank properties, and the land bank has been much more active in selling properties for building homes, whether it's I want to go build one for myself or somebody wants to get a block, or we have there's a couple of areas where if you figured out how to buy 6 lots, you'd have 25 acres with the streets already built on a grid. Yeah, I mean, it's been huge areas. It's not Detroit, but
yeah. I mean, it is crazy when you start to think about the magnitude of 4,000 to 6,000, vacant lots, in one city.
Right.
So, on the remodel program, I think it's interesting as well, because that's something that a ton of cities just struggle with all the time. And you all were doing it too, where it's like, you got all these houses that are deteriorating, they're vacant, they're abandoned. Should we just pay money to tear them down? And it's like a big source of controversy within planning and politics for years, which is, do we allocate like $5 million to just tear all these houses down and get them ready for development, or do something else?
KCK brought the National Guard in. And at the time, it was probably the right thing, because there probably wasn't a market then. I mean, we've had, we kind of created this market and how we did that, but the increase in construction costs and, I think more young people wanting to live in urban areas and being not afraid of urban areas and things like that. I think all those things kind of led to that being able to be possible. I think when they started demolishing houses, there was no market.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't think I grew up in a suburb, south of Lee Summit in a private lake community. I never thought I would live in urban KCK. Yeah. I was born in KCK at KU. I'm a Jayhawk, from birth, but I never thought I'd be back there. But when I moved here, the people were great. And, so we stayed, but still there wasn't a great market, for a lot of those years in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, there wasn't a market to sell.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but even then, it sounds like this idea of sort of pre-certifying a property. I mean, how different is that from what you were doing before, or what you see other cities do?
Well, we would just let them sit on the tax sale rolls, and nobody would buy them, and they would just deteriorate. And then, we would use some of our federal funds to tear them down.
Yeah.
And, so if you tear down a house today, it probably costs you $20,000 to $25,000 to get it torn down, and then you get to mow it for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But a couple $1,000 a year.
Yeah.
Versus if you save that house and it gets put back on you give them a 10-year tax abatement, but it's on the tax roll, it's being maintained. You got somebody living there spending their sales tax, their money, and generating sales tax dollars. And then eventually you start getting money back for that. It's economically, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But the trick is, the first one we were worried about, can you get a mortgage on that house after it's been taken out in a tax sale, put through the land bank? So we got through that first hurdle. We figured that out. Now it's just kind of routine, but we can't buy houses for the land bank out of the tax sale anymore, because the people that like that business model are buying them directly from the tax sale. So they don't have to.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they don't even get to, I say I don't work there anymore, but they don't get to buy those out of the tax sale anymore.
Well, I mean, that seems like a win, though.
That's a huge win.
Yeah. So, when you were doing it that way, if it's just me and I want to buy one of those houses, I want to do it. What would I do? What was the steps that I would take? You just
went to the land bank and you fill out their form to say that, hey, I know how to hire a plumber and an electrician, and I have the funding to do, I have the ability to borrow the funds to do this and make this project happen within a year or 18 months. And
then you all as staff did some sort of background verification on that, basically. Yeah.
And we had very high success rate. And you wouldn't believe some of the houses that they saved.
Yeah.
I mean, holes in the roof and the second floor and the first floor and water in the basement. Yeah. And they would take that and fix it.
Yeah.
The ones that we had the hardest problem with were where you had, like, it had a wall fall out.
Mm-hmm.
But even a couple of those that had weird situations like that, people took.
I mean, I feel like this is almost like a conference session in and of itself, you know, where it's like you could probably speak just to this topic for over now. Were there other cities that were doing something like this that you noticed, or is this something that you all just kind of came up with?
So we had a gathering of basically all the development and department heads and all the people involved in development and taxes and some of the next level down out at, one of the park buildings one February day, and just said, how do we get out of our silos and help that and figure this stuff out? And all that kind of came out of that day. We looked a little bit at Detroit and Cleveland and places like that, but that's we really kind of self-generated that.
Yeah.
Because there's this huge problem. We know we got to fix it, right? We can't keep just tearing down houses, or we don't have a city left.
Right.
And we don't have a population left to support downtown or any of those kind of things.
Yeah. It feels like, it's almost like part of the Strong Towns mantra here as well, which was like, you just got together and figured out something locally that made sense for you all, and what the specific case was in KCK and how you could deal with it.
Yeah. That's very true. I mean, and we had support to do it.
Yeah.
Our goal, I think, was to touch 5,000 properties in 3 or 4 years, or 10,005 or something.
Yeah.
And we did.
That's incredible. Huh. Well, back on like the new construction side then. So it sounds like it would seem logical to me that once you are established this success rate with rehabs and stabilizing a lot of properties and other things, that ought to start to generate more of a market for new construction, especially on some of those narrow lots. And are you seeing any of that, or does that seem like it's going to happen?
There's some, and there's there's a little bit of ones and twos, going on. I want to buy this and build it for myself or my kid or whatever.
Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 kind of like bigger focus projects out there along parallel where you've got, 5 to 25 acres that are there. And those are taking longer. I mean, it's hard. I mean, the banks, they don't redline anymore in theory. But, you still got to show that you got a workable project, right? And who are your tenants going to be in your retail space? Well, you're not going to go sign Old Navy to a 3,000 square foot, 15-year lease right there. It's going to be small people that aren't going to sign long-term leases, and, to build commercial space. I think a lot of the urban commercial space that gets built is something that you do it small enough that the rest of the project, even if it never became a commercial space, you're still okay.
Yeah.
It's just a benefit if it fills up.
Yeah.
And, it's one thing with some of the plans that you see about, you want all this mixed use development. Well, very few places can support 100% first floor commercial in everything you do.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't even see that in the big cities, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of the codes got written that way early when you were doing the mixed use codes and stuff.
Oh,
Not
sure.
you, but in general, planners.
We all got enthusiastic,
right?
About it. And there's been a lot of there was a problem for years and years where things weren't allowed.
Right.
And then we overcorrected and almost tried to, I think the planning profession in general has tried to force too much ground floor commercial in places where it's just not ever really going to work.
Right. And, when we ended up doing the plan for downtown KCK, there are streets that are commercial now that under that plan wouldn't be in the future just because there's not that much demand in that area for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you still just don't have enough rooftops and purchasing power to really support.
If we fill up those 6,000 lots.
Well, there you go. So get working on that.
That's right.
You're not there anymore, so you can't do it.
Well,
you can do it in other ways. You can do it on the private side. Right. So one of the other fun projects we worked on was a greenfield project. And we had a client, a home builder, who hired us to do a master plan for about 150 acre site out in Western KCK. um, just before the recession. That
Couldn't have had worse timing.
Could not have had worse timing. Really great project called New Market. This was one of those, as I think back over the years, it just hurts me as much as anything. It's just so painful that this project never got built. But there was a lot of really interesting aspects to that. That was a walkable community on purpose. We did a lot of interesting things in terms of the little commercial center that was going to happen. They even put the first phase infrastructure in the ground, and then the economy collapsed and it just, it never happened. But I'm curious about, like, from the city side. I know from the developer side and the design side, some of the stuff that we went through and how painful that all was. But what was it like when as being part of the city government?
Well, it was very exciting because you have a developer that, and I don't know if he had a final plat approved, but he might have had his full preliminary plat for a regular cul-de-sac subdivision and his first final plat done.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who basically built one of our suburbs in Kansas City. I mean, it is a big time builder.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if he had done that, he would have been out of that before the recession hit.
Yeah.
I mean, but when he came to me, he says, I want to do a new town. I'm like, well, we don't have the ordinances for that. He's like, well, if I pay Kevin and you two work it out, are you good with that? And I'm like, awesome. So we did that. And, we had strong support from the mayor and the county leadership, city leadership. And it was a great process. I think the only hiccup we had, probably one of the only times in my career I got yelled at, was we had issues with the narrow streets and the fire department.
Right.
And the mayor asked me one day why we were having hold up and why we hadn't gotten through yet. And I told him, and one of the people in the administrator's office, who I'm still very good friends with, was like, why the hell did you tell the mayor about that? And I'm like, he asked me. It's like, well, you can't go tell the mayor things like that. We got to work those out internally. And I'm like, okay. But what I learned is we solved the problem. I got yelled at and life went on as normal. So we got it done. And they, there have been 3 other tries at that. And there's another one, and I'm actually one of my clients now to help them figure that out and what they can do with it. But the infrastructure that was put in has got to come out. I mean, the curbs, the sanitary, or all the sewers and stormwater and curbs and first layer of asphalt is now an expense instead of a benefit. It's been 15 years.
I know.
And it hasn't been used, and the curbs are popping out. And
so what happened? I would imagine there must have been some pressure after that all went back to the bank, which it did. There must have been some pressure to quickly, approve a new plan or to do anything else on that site, or what happened internally on your end?
Well, it's adjacent to 435. So there's always been a desire on the development side to have more density there than what the community wants, because the history of KCK is basically anybody that could afford to moved out of the city and moved out west to get away from the city issues that were going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so they see density as a city issue that they don't want to bring to where they moved away yet.
Sure.
Bring out to them what they moved away from. And so, I think we had maybe 160 or 120 apartments in there, one little apartment section in there. And everybody's always wanted to expand that. There wasn't a lot of pressure on it. I mean, everybody was like, the recession was so bad. Everybody was focused on other things. We had, rotating layoffs and salary reductions and all kinds of things in the city that people were more focused on than that. The recession was, I don't even think that caught people's eye until after the recession was done. It was just, almost every subdivision in KCK went back to the bank during the recession. I think this developer kept one by trading others around to keep the one that they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the finances to, fix some of the ills of the recession for their own benefit.
Yeah.
And maybe one other, but we didn't, the only people that were building any houses were guys that kind of had a sugar daddy that would, write the check out of his account, and it wasn't through a bank. You weren't built.
Yeah.
You weren't getting any construction loans out of a bank at the time. I think it just went over people's head, and it disappeared until somebody got interested in it and it came back.
Yeah.
The recession was really, there were a lot of very painful issues in KCK beyond that subdivision or any of the subdivisions out west.
Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine it probably had a huge impact overall on city revenues. And that must have been because you had a lot of your revenues were driven by some of the new growth out west anyway, which kind of came to a halt. So, well, one of the other things that I know that you and I've talked a lot about and that you have a big interest in was really expanding like the bicycle network in whatever ways that you could. I'm curious, like why, first of all, why did you have an interest in that?
Well, I rode my bike a lot as a kid till I got a car. And even after I got a car, I still rode a lot, but I was riding 6 or 8 miles to school every day.
Mm-hmm.
And, then we would ride, from Lee Summit out to Lone Jack on 50 highway and not get passed by any cars at, 3:00 in the afternoon, which you laugh because, now that that would be,
that'd be impossible.
That'd be impossible to do. And so I've always liked riding. Always been a big sidewalk person, and in Independence and in KCK, really had to fight with the city engineers to get sidewalks added to major thoroughfares, maybe to the point of a little bit of ridicule. It was kind of ugly, but it worked. I didn't know how else to get it done. So, whatever tactics you have to use to make good things happen, sometimes you use those, but I'm probably not as proud of that, but in the end, it's been good. Yeah. So in 2012, I think we did a or sidewalk and trails plan. Mm-hmm. We couldn't call it a bike plan because politically, so we had to call it sidewalk and trails.
It just would have been torpedoed if you called it a bike plan
from the get-go.
Yeah.
But I was actually riding my bike to the drive-in movie night at the Boulevard Drive-In to promote the plan, and I got hit riding my bike. Mm-hmm. I still suffer from that. I get a couple bad discs and a couple bad vertebrae from that. But the irony of that has never left me.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do, it's hard. And if you look at, kind of being competitive in the metro area, it was kind of always one of the thoughts in my back of my head, whether it was retail or residential or your community. If you're doing retail, you want my mom as a customer. Mm-hmm. She can go wherever she wants to shop, and she doesn't go to places that aren't nice. So you got to be nice. If you want the folks with disposable income, you got to build something nice, and so that was kind of in the back of my head. But also, if you look at what do people look at when they're moving, and schools is obviously number one, mm-hmm. which KCK is not going to win that battle. Mm-hmm. It will in the urban area. I think our schools are great, and we can compete with Kansas City, Missouri, and other urban districts. But you're not going to compete with Blue Valley or Lee Summit or Blue Springs or something like that. But then you start looking at amenities. Well, we have a great urban network with sidewalks that need help, and bike paths and sidewalks are one that they're expensive, but they're not outrageously expensive that you can't start to provide some of that stuff and look at your network and how that's going to work to build your city in the future. And so that's kind of where I focused on those. What amenities can we provide as a community that, maybe the development community will build a lot of it for us, and we can fill in the gaps and really mm-hmm. make our city better that way and more competitive that way. Because on number one, we don't score very well. Mm-hmm. So let's see what we can do for number two.
Yeah. And it seems like when we talked about this over the years, you really tried to focus a lot more even on like the trail portion or off-street paths for biking as a way for KCK to really get rolling. Is that right?
Yeah. It was definitely part of the plan, and trying to figure that out, was difficult. And we did a lot of work along Turkey Creek, trying to extend the bike path along the creek. Mm-hmm. And we actually did it as part of a street reconstruction project where we didn't actually put our portion along the creek. We did ours on street, and that was a very successful project and actually gets a lot of use. And I see people on it all the time. And mm-hmm. If you look at the old pictures of Merriam Lane versus what it is now, it's great. But I've always thought biking on the street was, I mean, if you knew what you're doing, you'd probably be okay. But, you know, I've had friends hit. I mean, you know, one of our colleagues' husband was almost killed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I got hit, and I know what I'm doing. I mean, you know, I know what to look out for. But when the guy tries to get between you and the semi truck, and his mirror catches your handlebar, you know, you get there. You can't avoid the idiot drivers, and so I love the protected bike lane stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would love to. My dad has like an old Honda motorcycle that it's a cool old 60s bike.
Mm-hmm.
My drive to work was like 2 miles, right? It would be perfect. But I got hit like in my car 3 times. I'm like, I'm not getting on something that doesn't have protection in this, you know, in this urban area, and riding around. So it's like, how do you make that work? Because as a kid living out kind of by the country, I rode my bike everywhere.
Right.
You know, I had a dirt bike, and we had trails, and then, you know, we could ride into Lee Summit and go to Dairy Queen or whatever. You know, we had all kinds of freedom that my kids never had.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're not riding on the street here.
Yeah. I mean, I had the same thing but I was in a small town,
you
know, a small town of 20,000 people. And I just rode my bike everywhere as a kid for, you know, for years and years, as a little kid too. Which, you know, and I'd love to give my kids that kind of freedom in the city, but I'm terrified to let them do that. You know, frankly.
I mean, we had to load up the bikes and go to the Merriam bike trail, you know, go to the farmer's market, Merriam, unload the bikes, ride for an hour, and light them back up and go back home.
Yeah. So you also, but then you, and I think it's part of the challenge too in Kansas City. I mean, I think we like biking. I got an e-bike. I love e-biking. I think it's awesome. I think the potential for a lot of it's incredible, but we're still, you know, we're not Denver, we're not Minneapolis, we're not Portland, where there's like a huge biking culture. And we may get there one day, and I hope we do, but it's just not the case now. So there's a lot of tension with trying to even design and pay for bike facilities.
Yeah, I think we're going to get there, though. You know, growing up, I never thought I'd live in an urban neighborhood, you know, but I do. My kids all want to live like River Market to Crossroads, you know, and so I think with the newer generation, that's more, they like the urban lifestyle, that they like that, you know, they're more willing to live there. I think we're going to get a lot more of those facilities. Same with the streetcar, you know, you're going to get a lot more support for that kind of stuff as we move forward. You know, I grew up driving like 40 minutes to my parents' business.
Yeah.
You know, I don't like the 40-minute drive. I like my 4-minute drive.
40 minutes is good for putting a podcast on, though.
It is good for it's good now that I'm driving 40 minutes a lot now.
Yeah.
From one of my clients, but so the podcasts are great for that.
Yeah. So were there other lessons learned from the bike, what did you call it? Your bike and pedestrian plan?
Sidewalk and trail plan.
Sidewalk and trail plan. Were there other lessons learned from that were useful from KCK's perspective?
Well, one of the things we did, I thought was very smart on the contractors, we had them use interns to do all of our survey work. So they hired KU grad school interns to do, and other interns to do all the survey work, so we got all of our sidewalks in the city surveyed for like $6,000.
Wow.
Which if the company would have done it, it would have been $25,000.
Yeah.
So that was a good strategy to use. That was something I like. This is a perfect use for interns. And so they did, that was a good learn from that. I should have fought harder for a couple of things. Johnson County Water One did a water line through Western KCK, and I had them agreed to build a bike path along like 15 miles of bike path. And one person's friend didn't want bikes running through his front yard, and one person that had a vote on the plan got it killed. And so I should have fought harder for that. I should have, you know, done everything I can. I mean, you know, the value of a 15-mile bike path is amazing.
Yeah.
You know, you got to fight for some of those things when you can, and maybe that all happened so late in the process, and I just I didn't have a chance. You know, it's been a long time ago now, but you know, you got to fight for some of that stuff when it comes up and it's available to fight for it. The looking for easy linkages to other facilities was a key to that plan. If we could link to Turkey Creek and the Johnson County system, that's a win, because then we get hundreds of miles of trails that our people have access to that we didn't have to pay for.
Right.
And then, going north of the Missouri River, convincing MoDOT and KDOT to put a bike lane on the bridge out of Fairfax gets us, you just ride through Fairfax and you can get to Riverside and Parkville bike trails.
Right. Yeah.
And then really back around Kansas City, Missouri, because then you can get back over to Burlington, and, it just opens up the world to you. Mm-hmm. Or across the viaduct through the West Bottoms, that link was kind of in the works when I started, but those kind of things were very important to a poor urban community that wasn't going to go build 100 miles of bike trails in 5 years.
Right.
Making those links available, and then figuring out how to get spines through the community mm-hmm. to do that, and then apply for federal grants. Because I will tell you that some of the suburban communities tried to redo the rating scale after I went in. I got 4 of the top 5 projects. I couldn't afford them all. Right. I had to pick because we couldn't afford to do all those, but urban projects score well. And, but that was kind of a fun, to call them out on why they were wanting to do that, because what they agreed to before was a great scoring method, and what the metro area needed when they didn't win, they got. And
we got to change the method.
We got to be crybabies about it.
Yeah. That's the way things always go, right?
Right.
You have the plan, and then if it doesn't work, somebody
changes. The other thing I think you have to do in bike paths and bike planning, that was always, even back into independence, what makes sense for the non-professional biker? All right. Yeah. For a long time, the bike clubs ran the metro area bike infrastructure for the way they rode. Well, the way you and I might ride as very experienced cyclists is not how the world rides.
Right.
And if you want the world to support your program, you need to build it to the way the world can get through it and use it safely.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means you have to go a little bit out of your way. And if you want to stay in the lane, you are free under state law to stay in the lane. But the safe path mm-hmm. is to go where you don't have to look 5 directions at an intersection.
Yeah.
On an interstate, you go down the ramp a little bit, cross where you only have to look at what's coming down the ramp at you, and come back up to the sidewalk.
Yeah.
If you stay in the lane, stay in the lane. Good for you, good for me, whatever. But I think you have to look at some of those issues when who's going to use this? How do you build your market? And, building your market isn't always building it to what the bike club wants.
Yeah. I think there's that.
Sorry, bike club.
Well, it's true. There's that famous survey that was done, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. I think it was in Portland area, but it just tried to classify the types of cyclists, and something like 60% or 2/3 were what they called interested but concerned. They might want to ride a bike, but they're really concerned mm-hmm. about their safety, which is, I think, how most of us are. I'm really not much different from that. I'm not now that I've got the e-bike, I'll go a lot more places than I used to go, because I have more control and more ability to get out of a bad situation quickly. But I'm still really cautious, and I'll go up on sidewalks if I need to, and do things that are not, what you're supposed to do,
right?
As a hardcore cyclist.
Yeah. And, since I've been hit, I've probably ridden less than a mile on a road, and I was on the Katy Trail, and part of the trail was out, and we had to ride on the highway.
Yeah.
And me, I'm a pretty confident. I don't get scared a lot.
Yeah.
I did not like it when those cars went by me.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it would affect me that much, because I've had bad crashes. Mm-hmm. I've cracked helmets and, whatever. And, I got on one of the MS-150s, I got my front wheel caught in a railroad track that kind of crossed the road at a funny angle and threw me off the bike, way off the bike. And, and none of that ever bothered me. Getting hit has probably had more of a subconscious impact on me than I would have realized. I still haven't fixed that bike.
Huh.
So it's,
You've still got the bike.
I still have the bike.
Yeah. Interesting.
But it's, and I have another road bike, but I haven't, and riding on the Indian Creek Trail isn't fun with those because you can't go fast enough.
Maybe you should take that old mangled bike and hang it up on the wall somewhere as like a monument.
Yeah. It didn't mangle that bad. it really just needs a derailleur and the front wheel treat a little bit. It didn't get run over.
It was more you that got mangled, not the bike.
I got flipped over the car. I mean, my back hit where the window comes down on the back. And so that's what, and then I was laying in the middle of 7th Street, south of Kansas Avenue. I'm like, am I going to get run over? And I was hurt. I mean, it was not good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is a perfect case in point of what people are scared about, and for good reason, because there is a lot of very inattentive drivers. And if you don't have some protection, you could end up like that.
Yeah. You have inattentive drivers and you just have flat, mean people. I mean, on one of the MS-150, somebody just ran over a guy because he was on a bike on the highway. I mean, so you got to be careful. And I think providing some good infrastructure for that. And, one of the things we did on our general road standards on arterial and collector streets is one side is a minimum of 8 foot, but if you don't have other obstructions, 10 or 12 feet, so that you can call it a multi-use path and you can actually ride your bike on it and be legal and, so that you can get off those streets and have a little bit of barrier between you and the cars and stuff. Yeah. But you still have to be careful, and you can't, and if you're riding a bike, obey the traffic laws, because when you don't obey the traffic laws, it infuriates the drivers and that makes all of us look bad. And then they don't care if they hit us. Yeah. So, and I mean, there's so much of that goes on, and in the motorcycle community too. Yeah. I mean, they do, the guys that do the crazy stuff that make everybody mad, then, it has an impact on everybody. Yeah.
Well, it makes the drivers angry and then they just feel more justified in, being an asshole if they want to be.
Right. So you see the bike club go through and they don't stop at a stoplight. They just all roll through it or the stop sign. I'm like, that does none of us any good. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but we've already done an hour, so we should probably wrap it here.
Really?
Believe it or not, it goes by quickly. But it's cool. We'll do this again because there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk about related to like the political side of the job and, working on all through that. Especially you had 3 different cities now, and you also had experience on the private side with it. So there's a lot to dive into there. But I do want to wrap it up, and I'm going to ask you the question that other people ask. This is the Messy City podcast. So I like to hear from people about what they think of as a place they consider messy or more organic or bottom up that and love. It could be a neighborhood, could be a whole city. What comes to mind when you hear that?
Well, I think, KCK, has got to be my messy city, but we were kind of talking beforehand. I was trying to figure out what wasn't a messy city. Yeah. And it's like Overland Park, Kansas, it's rebuilt all of their old infrastructure already, and it has all neat, nice new curb streets and sidewalks. I mean, that's not a messy city. Right. But beyond that, I don't know what isn't a messy city. Even some of the suburbs that had old downtowns and had older areas, if they haven't gone through and rebuilt all that stuff, I mean, they have some of those issues. They have got combined sewers, and we haven't even talked about combined sewers or anything like that. If you got a combined sewer, you're probably a messy city. At least you smell like one in the summer.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
But KCK has a lot of issues that we've talked about, a lot of them. But, in independence, I thought I knew politics. Then I got to KCK and, it was bigger.
Yeah. Was there outside of your neighborhood in KCK, was there a part of the city that you think of that you really enjoy the most?
I would say the Strawberry Hill Central Avenue area, is really, really cool. And there's a lot going on there. Mm-hmm. A lot of really vibrant businesses that are both American and Latino businesses, and a good mix. And there's a strong food truck game down there right now too. I don't know if you've been over there. There's a lot of good food trucks and good restaurants, and the taco trail on KCK is great. So
it's some of the best food in the whole area, but no doubt about it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Rob. This was a lot of fun, and we'll do it again.
Good deal.
All right. Take care.